Starting with Chapter 2, the Egyptian house and its furniture, food and drink, etc. From the dwellers on the Nile, the life, history, religion, and literature of the ancient Egyptians by E.A. Wallis Budge. The earliest inhabitants of Egypt, long before the course of the Nile was fixed, and whilst the valley was full of swamps and marshes, sheltered themselves behind straight screens made of reeds tied together with vegetable fiber. Later it occurred to some of them that they would obtain more shelter if they bent the screen round as to form a circle, leaving a space to serve as a door, and very soon they began to plaster the screen with mud, which served as a protection against wind and sun. A roof was formed by laying reeds and palm branches on the top of the circular screen, and little by little the circular hut was evolved. Long before the dynastic period of Egyptian history, the Egyptians began to make their huts or houses of the mud deposited by the Nile. Some of that was already kind of done by primates, but not non-human primates, but not quite to the extent that humans end up doing it. Animals kind of may surround themselves with plants, but they don't weave them together and plaster them in place. At first, the walls were made by piling up the mud in lumps. Well, there are animals that build mud huts and stuff in lumps, one on top of the other. But experience showed that these walls often fell in or fell out because the lumps of mud contained nothing that would bind them together. Gradually, the circular form of a hut or house was abandoned, and men began to build houses rectangular in form. One of the oldest examples of this kind of mud house was preserved in the British Museum, number 35,505, and from this we see that in the late Neolithic period, the Egyptians, rumbling in the tumbly again, and watch, no rumbling in the tumbly. Well, you won't see it when the program's over. And from this, we see that in the late Neolithic period, the Egyptians built houses with both windows and doorways, and with matted sides. The inclination of the walls inwards gave them greater stability. The doorposts, etc., were made of wood, and it seems that the wooden doors were known when the Egyptians began to make bricks is unknown. Some authorities think that the art of brickmaking was introduced into Egypt from Mesopotamia, but there is no good reason why the Egyptians should not have found out for themselves how to do this. The early Sumerian bricks, say 3000 BCE, are plano-convex, but the oldest Egyptian bricks have not this form, and all of them are unbaked. In building the primitive houses of unbaked bricks, no mortar was used. The circular or square hut, made of reeds and palm branches and mud, contained only one room. The latter mud brick houses, in which wood was used for doors and the frames, etc., probably contained 2 rooms or more. But, from first to last, the Egyptians generally lived in mud brick houses, and everyone who has lived for any length of time in their country will admit that provided the walls are thick enough, mud brick houses are preferable to those built according to European models. Entities as well as men lived in plaster and reed houses, even in the early dynastic period, and the form of the circular hut, which served as a shrine for Menu, is represented on stela of the 18th dynasty, but the shrines of several of the entities were rectangular, and their shape and some of their characteristics are preserved in the granite shrines down to the Ptolemaic period. The early kings also dwelt in houses or palaces made of mud bricks and decorated with stonework. The fact that Chasser a king of the third dynasty, built a house of stone for himself, was considered to be such a remarkable event by Menethu, a priest of Siboneytus in the 3rd century BCE, that he specially mentions it when speaking of Djeser in his list of the kings of Egypt. But there's a lot more astounding things that are older than that, but it may be noted in passing that Mr. C. J. Firth of the Government Service of Antiquities of Egypt found the remains of this house and its fluted stone columns in 1924. It is impossible to give details of the early Egyptian houses, for, being built of mud or mud bricks, they soon, owing to the annual inundations of the Nile, cracked or fell down, and others were promptly built up on their ruins. Under the New Kingdom, stone and metal were freely used in the construction of the houses of well-to-do persons. The doors, which were sometimes single and sometimes double, were often set in stone frames on which were cut the names of the owner and magical symbols, as at the present day, and sometimes to these was added an inscription containing phrases of laudation of the entity under whose patronage the master of the house placed himself and his house. Rich men framed their doors in copper, and frame plates were often inscribed. A good example of an inscribed house door belonging to Khensutep is exhibited in the British Museum, number 566. Doors were secured by bolts made of wood or metal and simple contrivances which served as locks. Modernized forms of such contrivances can be seen in many outlying districts of Egypt and in Nubia and in the northern Sudan at the present day. Up to a comparatively late period, when a man of wealth was going to build a house, an animal was sacrificed by him in order to obtain the goodwill of the spirits of the earth, and as figures of entities and amulets of various kinds have been dug up from the floors and out of the walls, we may assume that they were placed there to protect the fabric of the house from the attacks of evil spirits. From the large Venet in the Papyrus of Necht in the British Museum, number 10,471, we learn that the houses of well-to-do folk were provided with what are commonly called wind catchers, i.e. triangular wooden erections, which were placed on the roof and were open to receive the cool wind from the north. These caught the wind and made it to blow down into the house. Every purely Arab house has its mawkaf, which has the same form as its old Egyptian equivalent. And let's stop here from the Venet, from the Papyrus of Necht, a military scribe who flourished 1250 BCE. The deceased and his wife are standing in their garden between their house and the ornamental lake adoring Osiris, behind whom stands Ma'at. The house is provided with wind catchers on the roof. The text above is a hymn to Ra. So despite might have used a better word to describe the building of the wind catchers, because there's ambiguity there, isn't there? In some parts of Upper Egypt, large houses may have been provided with sardabs, or underground chambers, in which the inmates withdrew for coolness during the heats of the summer. But in Lower Egypt, such chambers would be made uninhabitable through the infiltration of Nile water. In the Venet mentioned above, the house is built on a platform in the form of the hieroglyph Ma'at, which means truth, and has 4 rectangular windows. Well, it's like a rectangle, but it kind of on one side. And has 4 rectangular windows placed high up in the wall to prevent surface dust from blowing through them. Many large houses stood in the courtyard, planted with vines and palms and other fruit trees, and close by it was a small ornamental lake containing fish and lotus and other water plants. Such a garden formed a paradise for birds. Nearby were the quarters of the servants or slaves, which consisted of a series of low mud huts, and the storehouses for grain and other articles of food. The granary was strongly built, and was usually rectangular in form, and was provided with a stout wooden door and massive bolts and other fastenings. Along one side of it was a series of bins, with shutters through which the grain was poured in or taken out. The name of the grain in each bin was sometimes written above the shutter. A stairway led up to the roof of the bins, which was perforated in several places, probably for the purposes of pouring in grain or for ventilating the grain below. In some houses, a stairway led from the ground floor to an upper story, and in almost every house, a stairway gave access to the roof, where at one corner there stood a small shed to which the master of the house might retire for rest and meditation in the cool of the evening. By meditation, I don't think they meant blanking the mind or something that people tend to misunderstand about meditation. At a little distance from the house of the rich man, were the buyers for the cattle and the building in which the servants of the estate did their work and kept their tools and implements. Here, too, was the threshing floor, which was circular and resembled a shallow bowl. Every drop of water used in the house had to be brought from the river, and was stored in large porous jars, either set in a row in the ground or on a wooden stand, and all sanitary arrangements were of a primitive character. The mud on which the house stood formed the floor, and usually it was left in its natural state. The dust which worked up from it through the traffic over it was swept up and carried away, and water was sprinkled over the floor to prevent, for a short time, more dust from rising. Sometimes, as we see at Tal al-Amarna, the floor was decorated with frescoes representing aquatic landscapes with birds, animals, flowers, etc., but they were trodden on by many feet. The dust soon rose up as before. The walls of the rooms, and sometimes the roof, or as we should say, ceiling, were either washed over with a neutral colored wash or decorated with frescoes. From time immemorial, the Egyptians built along the walls outside their houses long, low benches of mud bricks, the tops of which were carefully plastered with mud from 3 to 4 feet wide and about 2 feet high. Benches of this kind may be seen today in many parts of Egypt and the Sudan, and the Arabs used them, as did the Egyptians, as beds or couches. Boys, youths, and some of the watchmen slept on them, a bundle of their own garments serving for a pillow, and a reed mat as a mattress. Those who slept on them probably had no other covering than the cloaks which they wore by day, and if we may judge by the habits of the modern Egyptians, their chief anxiety was to keep their heads covered. The master of the houses, protect you from the elements, thank you very much. The master of the house and some of his family slept upon bedsteads, which closely resembled the an-karib used by modern Egyptians. The rectangular framework and the 4 legs, which were carved in the form of the legs of a lion, were made of stout pieces of wood, and when the wood used was ebony, were often inlaid with ivory. The framework was decorated with a lion's head at one end and a lion's tail at the other, but occasionally the head of a hippopotamus took the place of the lion's head.